Yes.
Dr McClelland, I've got a range of questions which will dot around from topic to topic because they cover a range of different aspects of your evidence. Firstly, you told us yesterday that by the end of 1982 you were absolutely aware that of the possibility of the transmission of AIDS or the virus causing AIDS by blood or blood products. You'd read about the cases from the States and the San Francisco baby case. The response that you provided to the inspectorate was January 1983, and that appended the donor selection guide and the alphabetical guide that we looked at yesterday. Now, there's, I think, nothing in the alphabetical guide that would pick up upon any particular risk factors in relation to AIDS. Why is that, given that you were putting together a new document at that point?
I think, to be honest, it's probably a matter of timing. That document probably took quite a time to put together, because I know that in doing so, Dr. Smith, who did it, did her best to sort of correlate our recommendations with, other, certainly European and probably American recommendations, so that and to cross-check it with what was being used in England, so that hopefully we weren't out on a limb with any of the criteria. And I can't remember exactly what my evidence was about when I think I first became aware of HIV transmission by blood, but it was probably at the very beginning of '82 when, and to be honest, I can't remember when that document was actually put into active use. But I probably took me a little bit of time to sort of think through what the implications of that were for my own service. I obviously started thinking about it fairly early in 1982 and discussing it with colleagues and probably trying to get some more information from others in the UK. Did have some contact, I think, probably by phone with the CDC in the United States to sort of try and understand a little bit more of the background of some of what was in the MMWR reports. So I think we probably didn't feel quite ready to incorporate something about AIDS into the donor selection criteria until we had something that we were happy to communicate to donors. To be honest, I can't honestly remember whether I gave active attention to the wording of the AIDS-Z guideline in relation to AIDS at that point. I may simply not have thought of doing it at that point.
I think you said a few moments ago that you were thinking about it fairly early in 1982, discussing it with colleagues, trying to get some more information. Do you mean 1983? I mean
1983, I'm sorry.
No, that's quite all right. Turning then to the facilities at the centre and the kind of issues thrown up by or exposed by the inspection report, but which you yourself were well aware of in terms of the limitations. Over what time period did the inadequacies of the facilities impact on the safety of blood or blood components, both directly, limiting collection capacity, limiting donor privacy, processing problems, whatever it might be, or indirectly, because you had to be preoccupied, for example, with that rather than with other matters?
Well, to answer the first part of that, I think I referred yesterday to the fact that we were perfectly well. I was perfectly well aware that the facilities were substandard, and I was also very well aware that we were then, I had inherited also what the inspector described as a processing system in which some elements he described as open, which actually what that means is it required the connection of one blood pack to another, both connectors were sterile. So it was as open, for example, as when you connect a syringe to a needle to take a blood sample. So the word open perhaps gives a rather worse impression than what was actually happening. But recognizing that we were acutely sensitive to the possibility that we might cause contamination of blood units with bacteria, that was the principal risk, and it was a known risk of transfusion, which actually was in earlier days was responsible for quite a lot of mortality and morbidity. During the time that facility was operating and that we were using these so-called open connections, we were not, two things, we were not, never received any reports of septicemia in a blood recipient. And unlike the late reporting of non-NLB hepatitis, septicemia would be reported very rapidly because it comes on. An infected unit of blood will produce severe illness in the recipient very quickly. We only ever received one report of bacterial contamination in a unit that had been produced by our centre. That unit had been sent to a hospital in London via the South London Blood Transfusion Service. And Dr. Bolton actually spent several days in that hospital investigating what had happened with this unit, and it realized that it had been placed in the blood bank, issued for a patient, returned to the blood bank, issued to a patient again, returned to the blood bank, and it was the third time of issuing that the unit had become contaminated and infected the recipient. And that was the only occasion during my experience there where there was bacterial contamination had occurred. Viral contamination really was not a problem in relation to the inadequate processing facilities.
But you
there was a second part of the question, which I've forgotten, sorry.
There may be other respects in which the facilities and their inadequacies impacted upon the issues with which this inquiry is concerned, either by taking you away from other responsibilities or taking colleagues away, or because it limited, for example, the scope for donor sessions, privacy of donor sessions, and so on. When did those kind of problems get resolved?
I think both of those apply. I mean, there's no doubt that I think is evident from the documents that we've looked at that it was a major preoccupation for me. But, it was a major concern and a cause of great frustration that we didn't really receive the support that we needed to rebuild the place. I watched Dr. Marcella Contreras' evidence, and she said, I told the regional health authority that our centre was not fit for purpose, and they built a new one. That's what should have happened for us, perhaps. Now, yes, it distracted me. Limiting donors. Well, certainly the blood donor centre facility was very poor. The donors were remarkably tolerant of that. I don't remember donors complaining about that, but it was size limited. We could not, for example, have undertaken plasmapheresis in that centre, although at the time that we were in that centre, we hadn't really embarked. I don't think actually the machinery for plasma FFP collection by plasmapheresis had yet come on the market. But yes, it was a limiting factor.
And was that the position throughout the first half of the 80s, or did there come a point in time at which those kind of difficulties were resolved?
Oh yes, there did. The first there was a sort of chronology which we've to some extent gone into. The components processing, we moved into better but not ideal accommodation not that long after the inspectorate. It was already in, that move was already funded, and the new old building, as it were, was being converted. That was the Livingston House building. So that provided much better space, much more room, and the sort of air handling sort of facilities and so on were much better. The inspector still criticised some features of the building, but acknowledged that it was a great improvement from where we are, and it was the best that we could do at the time. Then, and I cannot remember the exact date, but that moved. We were possibly in that building for 2 or 3 years. You may have this information, but I can't remember. During which time we did obtain funding to make substantial changes to. Yes, I'm trying to get the chronology here. Sorry. We moved. Let me correct myself. We first of all were able to move the blood donor centre into the ground floor of the new Royal Infirmary building, which we discussed yesterday, which was on the same site as the main BTS and the old hospital. So that provided a vastly improved blood donor area, which really was and is still operating. It's perfectly up to today's standards with subsequent relatively minor modifications. Sometime later, we were able to convert another space in that building, which was again a modern building, into a new blood components reception and processing area, which provided a very much better environment and reasonably adequate space, and was generally considered by the inspectors to be acceptable. I must confess that having seen the centre in which I'm sitting at the moment, I realised that, what we had then was nothing to the standard of what is available here today, but many years ago.
We've talked about the donor consultant post occupied originally by Dr. Anne Smith. Was there an equivalent donor consultant post in the other regions of Scotland at that time?
No.
Do you know why?
Well, I can give a partial answer to that. The donor, the post of doctor, it's sort of in charge of donor matters in my centre had been occupied for many years by a lady who was graded as a medical assistant, which as an associate specialist, forgive me, which was a career grade, but lower than a consultant, with different responsibilities and a different job description to a consultant post. And I think that in the other Scottish centres, that post was also occupied by people of the same grading. I had the opportunity, because this lady retired, and I had already kind of realised that there were some very, very tricky problems, very difficult problems to deal properly with the issues of blood donor selection, and likely with the introduction of further tests and so on. And I wanted somebody who was really, really professionally a very good medic to do that job. And Dr. Smith was available, and she was a haematologist and an extremely capable and practically minded person. And for the relatively short number of years that was with us, she had an enormous impact.
there was a roughly 18-month gap between Dr. Smith leaving and Dr. Gillan taking her place. I think from around the autumn of 1983 to the spring of 1985. And Dr. Gillan told us that during that period you essentially had that responsibility. Did that have an impact, the absence of a specified donor consultant in that period, on the service's efforts to maintain effective donor management?
I think by that, sorry, I haven't got a calendar brain, but I think by that time I had appointed Mrs. Thornton, Mary, she was Miss McLeod when I appointed her, who was extremely able and very quickly, became very effective at managing the donor program. So as far as the day-to-day management of the donor program goes, I was very comfortable with her really doing the lion's share of the work. We certainly discussed issues frequently, and you're aware it was her that really alerted me to the prisons issue. Yes. I had very considerable confidence in her from quite an early stage, and that has been justified over the years.
Were there limits as to how long plasma would be kept between donation and fractionation, and between donation and administration to the patient?
Well, there are two different products really concerned here. The first one, I actually can't answer because it was really that lies with the fractionators. There are standards which are controlled by the Medicines Control Agency, or were, I should say, the Medicines Control Agency, as to the duration of plasma storage under, I think, minus 40-degree conditions. It is very stable under those conditions, but I can't actually tell you what the rules were for duration. As far as storage for clinical fresh frozen plasma for transfusion as a clinical product, it was also stored at minus, I'm pretty sure it was stored at minus 40 also. I'm certain it did have a shelf life, which was a frozen shelf life, which was probably 1 year, but I would have to look at documentation to be certain of that. There was a definite and shorter shelf life requirement.
You described Dr. Ludlum as having had rather different objectives to his predecessor. What were those objectives, or what was your understanding of those objectives and the differences between him and Dr. Davis?
There were quite profound differences in, I think, their view of what was the optimal treatment for a patient with hemophilia. They were of different generations, in very, very different generations. Dr. Davis was extremely principled and highly conscientious doctor, whom I think everyone who worked with him had enormous respect. He was conservative, as one would expect, and as I said yesterday, on reflecting back, he gave a very high priority to patient safety, and for that reason was very reluctant to use concentrated plasma products like factor VIII concentrate. I should also say that, because of the timing of his working life and retirement, those products were still relatively young by the time Dr. Davis retired, and so he probably didn't actually have that much experience of using them, and may well not have had the experience with his patients of seeing the extent to which they could improve their quality of life. Dr. Ludlum, in contrast, was my generation, had trained he'd been a senior registrar, I think possibly even a registrar in the Hemophilia unit in Cardiff, which was run by Dr.
Bloom.
Dr. Bloom. My memory for names has not improved with the passing years. Yes, and Dr. Bloom was, had a much more interventionist, I think if one would say, a much more active view of what could and should be done for the patients with haemophilia. And Christopher Ludlum obviously brought that philosophy and tradition to Edinburgh and was very much au fait with the developments, that were becoming possible because of the wider availability of factor VIII concentrates for home treatment, for prophylactic treatment, and for treatment of patients with inhibitors that required enormous doses of factor VIII, and for corrective joint surgery, which was a fairly major procedure, often on the knee, because that was a joint that was very, very often damaged quite early in these patients, and those were procedures that had the potential for bleeding massively and required the availability of very large quantities of factor VIII before one could contemplate undertaking the surgery. So each of those aspects, home therapy, prophylactic therapy, and much more surgery, were very much part of Dr. Ludlum's agenda, and which was very much focused on trying to provide for the patients the treatment that would give them either preserve quality of life for the younger patients or improve it for the patients who had crippling consequences of earlier insufficient treatment. And I have absolutely no doubt that his motivation was entirely to do the best he could for his patients. Absolutely no doubt of that.
I asked you earlier about the investigations into the implicated batch in the autumn at the tail end of 1984. Is it right to understand, in relation to the 16 patients who were tested by Dr. Tedder, that there was one recipient who did not get that batch, and so there must have been at least one other infected batch which infected that recipient?
Yes, I think that was the conclusion. That you may have. There is a later document which was prepared by Dr. Cuthbertson, which is a later analysis. I imagine you've already considered that, but it does have a bearing on the question.
And then, in terms of infections in Scotland by blood transfusion, so not factor concentrates, the conclusion of the Penrose inquiry was that there were 18 individuals infected with HIV by blood transfusion in Scotland. Is it fair to assume that that probably means 18 infective donations?
It is, because the chance of any one donation be infected is as you know, very, very small. The probability of a single patient receiving 2 infected donations would be very small multiplied by very small. So it's I think on probabilities, one would say a single donation was responsible.
And then you talked about what the newspapers were reporting prior to the 1983 Edinburgh Festival, and I think your evidence was that they were saying that Edinburgh may become the gay capital of the North. It's been pointed out to me that it was that Edinburgh may become the AIDS capital of the North. Can you recall that? I can check it with the documents if not, but
that may well be correct. I can't visualize the headline at the moment. It could well have said that.
Can you recall in the first half of 1983, or indeed the first 3/4 of 1983, whether you had discussions with Dr Ludlum about the risks of the donor pool being contaminated by AIDS.
I can't recall particular conversations, but I find it very. I almost certainly will have had discussions with him about that. I mean, if I hadn't initiated them, I'm quite certain that he would. And as I've explained, we were, we occupied the same offices, we walked down the same corridors, we often had coffee in the same canteen. So I think it is reasonable to assume that we discussed it.
And would it be reasonable to assume that there would have been discussions about, more broadly, about AIDS being transmissible by blood and blood products in the course of 1983?
Well, extensive discussions, I think. I mean, and I think I mentioned. I mean, I ended up doing quite a lot of lecturing about this, part of which would cover the sort of basic knowledge of who got it, and how it was transmitted. But I'd certainly would have talked about transfusion, would have talked about the hope for introduction of testing, I wrote a couple of pamphlets about it. One for the medical students, and I think we wrote other material for other groups, which was specifically designed to try and put in hopefully reasonably clear language what we knew, and to try to explain what we were, however insufficient it was without a test, what we were doing to try and mitigate the potential harm.
And would you have expected the Hemophilia Centre directors in Scotland, so not just Dr Ludlum, but the other Hemophilia Centre directors in Scotland, to be aware of the kind of measures like introduction of leaflets and so on that were being taken by SNBTS?
Oh yes, I'm sure they are. Absolutely sure they were very conscious of what we were trying to do, and probably pushing us to try and do more.
You talked about yesterday about donations having been obtained for testing from individuals at risk of hepatitis, which was subsequently tested for HIV when commercial kits became available. Is it Dr. Pethera? Probably mispronounced that.
Oh yes. This was. This was when the first commercial HIV tests from Abbott Laboratories in the United States became available, and I think they were supplied. I'm not sure they were supplied to us and we passed them to Dr. Puther, or he received them directly. But he was the sort of senior expert virologist in the microbiology department at the time, and a long experience of dealing with viral hepatitis. When he received this test kit, he chose from his archive of stored serum samples a group of samples which he felt, on the basis of his knowledge of hepatitis and his knowledge, which was probably similar to mine about the epidemiology of AIDS, he chose samples that he thought were likely to give him some positives if there were any around.
And do you know what his criteria were for selecting those samples?
I don't know in detail. He may well have written a paper in which that would be clearer, but they would have been samples which he had received to be tested for the presence of hepatitis B, I imagine. More than that, I don't think I actually ever knew the precise criteria that he used.
Was the preparation of the leaflet by you and Dr. Smith in May 1983 linked to or triggered in any sense by your knowledge of the Council of Europe recommendation? I think the recommendation itself was later, was in June 1983, but I think there'd been discussions and it was known beforehand that was going to be coming out of the Council of Europe's Committee of Ministers. Was that one of the things which might have triggered the exercise?
I don't think so. I think it was the I don't remember, as we're embracing the Council of Europe document, at the time that we prepared the first leaflets. I mean, later on, I was on that committee for a while, but I certainly wasn't in the relevant period. So I think we probably saw that after, or became aware of it after we prepared the first leaflets.
Was it right that you'd been storing donor samples for around 2 years before December 1984?
I can't remember the exact date, but yes, we had. I think it was probably after I became director, but exactly how soon after I became director, it might well have been 1981 or 1982, and I felt that it was important to do that because we didn't know what additional infections might emerge with passage of time. We already knew that it was important when there was, evidence for hepatitis B having been transmitted that we must be able to go back and retest previous samples, and I instructed staff to set up a sample archive. Later, some years later, we did the same for patients, and this thinking, I think, was probably a bit related to my discussions about the American study, which the TTV study, which didn't get done in Britain, which was really dependent on having a good sample archive. It may have been a bit unconventional at the time. It's very conventional now, as you know. But
well, it may be difficult for you to answer this if you can't recall when the storage of samples began, but might it have been linked to the early reports of AIDS in the States?
I don't think so.
Do you know how, moving to the events in December 1984, the meeting that took place, organised by Dr Ludlum. I'm not asking you again about the detail of the meeting, but do you know how the press had got the story of that, of haemophilics having been infected?
It wasn't in Edinburgh. It was the Aberdeen Press and Journal had the story, and I have no idea how they got it. I don't think I had any idea at the time.
Were blood or blood components donations in the South East Service ever tested for ALT? That we had some evidence, for example, from Professor Contreras that there was ALT testing on certain plasmapheresis donations. Was that ever the case in your region?
Yes, Dr. Gillan did a study, which we touched on earlier on today, of ALT in donors. I can't remember the exact date. It could have, mid-80s probably. It's published. The question that he was asking in that study was, what could we find out about the observable causes, the observable, let us say, associations with an elevated ALT in a group of donors. He also, I think in that study, did repeat testing on the donors, so that he had data from 2 or more time points possibly from successive donations, which would have been over sort of roughly 3 to 6 monthly intervals. That was relatively unusual to have a large quantity of longitudinal data like that. As I recall, and I'm dredging my memory here, he found that the strongest association with an elevated ALT was obesity, and how he defined obesity, I don't know, but he knew how to do that according to conventional methods. There were a lot of the patients had a single ALT, which did, only on one occasion of the tests was the ALT elevated. A third and not very surprising finding was that in the week after Hogmanay, a lot of donors had raised ALTs, which is perhaps not a great surprise. And I really can't remember the rest of the results, but the publication is in your archive, and I'm happy to, if there's any difficulty finding it, I'm happy to dig it out.
You told us in your statement too that you started doing HCV testing in July of 1991. Were you using the first generation tests at that point, or the second generation tests? Do you know?
I know that the main reason, one of the main given reasons for the latest, the last of the delays in the commencement date was the decision that we should wait for the second generation test. I can't remember which test we were using. I really can't remember. It probably was the second generation test.
Can I ask you to look at one document, SCGV 40/112_070? SCGV 40, so 0000 112_070. It's a letter from you, Dr. McClelland, to Dr. David Goldberg, copied to Dr. Aileen Keel and others, June 1997. And you were talking here about the archive samples of donor samples and what to do with them. What ultimately did happen to those samples? Were they destroyed?
We certainly did not at that time get the support that we needed to establish a proper archive, which would have been fairly big money, actually. I think that the patient samples that we had accumulated were destroyed, simply because we had run out. Not only we'd run out of deep freeze space, we had run out of space for the deep freezers. So we had a practical limitation. I think we felt that our priority had to be to retain the donor samples, because in a sense that was our primary responsibility. So as far as I know, but I would obviously have to check with current colleagues, those samples will be maintained, but probably for a finite period. So I should imagine that some of the samples or maybe all of the samples collected during my watch may well have been destroyed by now. But I would have thought a 5 to 10 year archive was a very sensible thing to do.
Dr. Gillan, now on the topic of look back, Dr. Gillan said in his evidence to the inquiry that he was told by Dr. Cash that look back was not undertaken nationally or in Scotland in 1991 in light of national events. And Dr. Gillan said he didn't know what that meant. He had, I think, some recollection of discussing it with you, and I'm not sure that you were necessarily any the clearer from from Dr Gillan's evidence, but do you have any sense of what Dr Cash might have meant by saying no look back in 1991 in light of national events?
Well, no, I watched this part of Dr. Gillan's evidence actually on YouTube, and I was as surprised as he was. I had no idea what he was talking about.
You mentioned in your evidence, and others have as well, the impact that the Gulf War had on donor collection. Do you recall whether the Falklands War had any discernible impact, at least in your region?
Oh gosh, when was the Falklands War? I can't.
82, I think. I can't remember either, but it's certainly the beginning, early 80s.
No, it didn't actually. In fact, one of our the doctor who became the director in Inverness was actually in charge of blood supply for the Falklands War, and he was in the Falklands on a hospital ship, and I'm sure that he told us, we talked about this quite a bit. I think the blood came from the ABSD, that was the Army Blood Supply Depot in Aldershot. Now, whether they collected blood on their own account or whether they were supplied by one or more of the London services, I don't know. But I have no recollection that any demand was made on us in Edinburgh by the Falklands as a result of the Falklands War.
Lastly, Dr McClelland, there are two propositions I'm asked to put to you and invite your comment and whether you think that they are fair. The first is this, that the system operated by the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service, so this isn't limited to your region, in the 70s and the first half of the 1980s was not reactive enough to be able to deal with new viral threats like HTLV3. Do you have any observations on that? Do you think that is a fair proposition?
I think, if one sets the standards of an ideal world, it would be highly desirable. It would have been highly desirable that it could react more quickly. But was it? I don't know what is reactive enough. I would always like to think that we'd been able to do the right thing quicker. I think I've, in my evidence, I've done my best to explain, my own understanding of the reasons why things took longer than I would have wanted them to. I think the question involves a value judgment that I'm not sure that I can make.
The second proposition is this. Again, it's really to see whether you have any comments or observations to make. That the system within the SNBTS placed too much faith in the altruism of the voluntary donor and was insufficiently cautious to the risks which donors can cause.
I think it would be difficult to place too much emphasis on the altruism of the voluntary donor, because if we didn't have them, we wouldn't have any blood and we wouldn't have had any factor VIII from the PSC. I understand exactly where the question is coming from, and I've thought about it quite a lot myself, and I've actually one of the last, I think it was actually the sort of last lecture I gave to the British Blood Transfusion Society or something, really did address that question. So I wouldn't say that was peculiar to the Scottish Blood Transfusion Service. I think it was a feature of the blood transfusion services in the United Kingdom, and it came from their origins in the Second World War, when the altruism blood donors contributed in a very important way to the war effort. And I think that that has remained in the sort of historical memory. I think we certainly, in my time, I think we did place a very high value on donors, and I think we believed that they were well motivated. And I think actually that was true. That was very true. People don't turn up to have a large needle stuck in their arm and give up an hour and a half of their time or whatever, plus traveling, for malign reasons. It's not particularly a fun thing to do. So, I mean, I think we were right to believe in the altruism, but whether we could have been more critical, if you like. We could have acted in a way that was more critical of the blood donors. But we were always aware of the risk that if we were too hard on the blood donors, they wouldn't turn up because we were entirely dependent on their goodwill. So to be sensitive to the feelings of the donors was not irresponsible. It was part of our job. But I'm absolutely clear, and I touched on this before our break, that I've always felt that the whole process was involved. Our responsibility was to maintain a safe link between the donor and the recipient and the patient, and that depended on us being as confident as we could that what the donor is giving us was safe and would be effective. Again, I think this is a very value-dependent question, and I can only do my best to provide perhaps a rather vague response.
Dr. McClelland, so those are the questions I am proposing to ask arising out of the range of suggestions I had from core participants. I'm just going to turn my back and see whether there was anything from Dr. McClelland's representative. No.
Well, I have no questions.
Dr. McClelland, is there anything that you would wish to add?
I don't think so. I would like just to thank you and your team for your diligence in providing a very comprehensive set of documents, which has made my job a bit more possible.
Well, it's my job to it's a very pleasant job to thank you for coming, for having the staying power. I think it's plainly been a tiring experience for you. 2 days going along as long today as we have. But can I thank you for your willingness to do that and to give us your insights. It's plain that you've been your own man in many ways throughout, and you've been quite clear about a lot of the views and opinions which you had and many of the reasons for them. And we learn from each of the witnesses we hear, very often with a slightly different perspective on the same matters as others have given us. And that's very valuable to help me try and put the pieces together and draw a composite picture at the end. Can I thank you for your part in that?
Thank you, sir.
Next month.
Next week.
Next month.
Probably.
1st of February, isn't it?
I've lost track of the days this week, sir. I'm not sure. You're no doubt right. We resume with Dr. McClelland, but with the other Dr. McClelland on Tuesday.
This is the Dr. McClelland from Northern Ireland.
It is.
10 o'clock on Tuesday.
Thank you, sir.